Hi friends, before we start the episode, I wanted to share that this is a great conversation with Campbell McDonald of Ownership at Work in the United Kingdom. I chalk it up to transatlantic gremlins, but there's a couple of spots where Campbell's audio dropped off that we just couldn't fix in the editing process. There's just a few of them, but I wanted to acknowledge them so you weren't fiddling with your volume thinking it was on your end. One of the things that didn't come through was where I expressed appreciation to Daniel Goldstein, who appeared on episode 278 of the podcast and introduced me to Campbell. My thanks to Daniel Goldstein. Finally, this was such a great conversation that ran almost 70 minutes in length, so we're going to present the first half to you today, and we'll bring you part 2 next week. Without further ado, let's start the episode.
Welcome to the EO Podcast with Bret Keisling, part of the EO Podcast Network.
Hello, my friends. Thanks for listening. My name is Bret Keisling, and as it says on my business cards, I'm a passionate advocate for employee ownership. I have said many times that growing EO anywhere helps growing EO everywhere. And I'm absolutely delighted in that respect to welcome on the podcast today Campbell McDonald, who's the Executive Director of Ownership at Work, a charitable think tank based in the United Kingdom. He's also one of the fellows at the Rutgers Institute. So I'm pleased to welcome to the podcast Campbell McDonald. Campbell, thank you so much for joining me.
Bret, thank you for having me. Delighted to be with you, sir.
It is a pleasure for me because there is so much kinship, if you will, between what's going on in the United Kingdom and what's going on in the United States. And I'm absolutely delighted to see all of the crossover experiences. Now, in the United States, for my American listeners, the Employee Ownership Trust is by far the way to go employee owned in the UK. And for listeners who are curious, our mutual friend Graham Nuttall came on the podcast a couple of years ago, and Graham is involved with Ownership at Work as well. But he explained the employee ownership trusts in a way that, to be honest with you, I had always looked at them a little bit skeptically, and he explained it in such a way that made me go, now I really get it. So I'll direct our listeners to the show notes of our podcast for the conversations. We'll include links with Graham's episodes to really give a good solid look at the backbone of employee ownership in the UK. And that will allow you and I to kind of talk more of the broader shared employee ownership themes, regardless of the nature of employee ownership, if that's okay.
Sounds perfect.
Excellent. So tell us, before we get into your EO aha moment, can you tell us just a little bit about Ownership at Work?
So we are a fairly small charitable think tank. We were set up about 4 or 5 years ago in our current form, and our charitable objectives are educational. We exist essentially to promote awareness and understanding of the impact of sharing ownership and participation in the workplace. We have, in the work that we've done, we've tended to focus, as you say, you're kind of on that broad-based employee ownership, worker ownership model, but actually our remit is really broadly across sort of industrial democracy of different kinds, and looking to kind of broaden and expand that as we go ahead.
So I imagine, and I've looked through, and again, we'll have a link to your website in our show notes, and there will be some contact information for you. And there are a couple of studies that you've done that were relatively big studies that hopefully we can talk about for a little bit. But it seems to me that there's a dual purpose of, we're going to do this research, and it seems quite exhaustive in some ways, that will show us what is the state of employee ownership. And then there's and here's how we're looking to the future and the lessons we've learned and how we can help grow not just employee ownership, but the broader democratization of the workplace.
That's really well observed. I mean, when I took this on, so look, my background, Bret, is I've been in the sector for about 16 years now. I started out, I was a consultant working with a business called the John Lewis Partnership in the UK, which is quite a large household name retailer, grocery provider in the UK. I absolutely fell in love with that business model when I came across it. And then a couple of years later, I had a chance to join a fund and create a consultancy and advisory business, which was 100% owned by a trust. And I did that. I ran that for 8 years. So by the time I got to being invited to become first a trustee and then sort of the chief exec of ownership at work. I'd been in the sector for over a decade. I'd been advising people, selling owners on, moving into the model. And I had done what every other professional advisor in the UK had been doing for 10, 20 years, which is you talk about the benefits of the model and, well, can you prove it? Where's the data? To which the answer was always, well, have you seen these very excellent examples of employee-owned businesses over here? What it was never was, here is a baseline study of employee-owned businesses compared with equivalent non-employee-owned businesses across the whole spectrum of the economy, comparing them on economic performance, on social impacts, on environmental performance, and saying like for like, well, who does better? We didn't have that. We just didn't have that baseline. And we were lucky enough to be able to support, to persuade the UK government in around kind of 2011, 2012 to think about a new intervention. And Graham absolutely led the charge on that. And we got this employee ownership trust into legislation. But we did it really by citing the American data. So we were sort of sat there in 2019 going, how are we still here? We've got this massive growing interest in this trust model, but we still don't have our own data set. And just looking with envy across the pond at our American cousins, and I'm talking to Joseph Blasi, who's been producing this out of Rutgers for 40 years. I'm like, this is nuts. We've got to do something about this. And the think tank gave me a chance to work with colleagues in the sector to fill that gap. And it was a long-term gap. So that was the driver. That was the ambition.
And I'm going to break my own rule, and we will get to your EO aha moment in just a moment. But to me, it's fascinating that you said, hey, we need our own data. And it's the cross-pollination in the United States. And I don't want to offend anybody, but probably the two biggest bodies doing research on employee ownership in the US is the Rutgers Institute for the study of employee ownership and profit sharing, and the NCEO. And I noticed that two of the fellows of ownership at work are Doug Cruz of Rutgers and Lauren Rogers of the NCEO. So you have brought in American experts to help with your own path.
We sort of extended those invites before we put together the knowledge program, this big 2-year piece of work that we did. But look, we created a program oversight board around that piece of research, and we plugged in Lauren and his very wonderful colleague Nancy. We plugged in Doug, but we also, kind of were appealing to Joseph as well, because we wanted to learn. Right. These guys had done it. They had the rich data, the kind of household income, social impact level data that we wanted to get to, or at least close to. So we wanted to make sure that what we produced was on a par with the US. So, yeah.
And I realized I ran the risk of, hey, here are the Americans to come help with your research. We have learned through, and I've shared on a number of podcasts, we have learned so much from the work that has gone on in the UK. John Lewis is a name that I'm familiar with, and those who really follow employee ownership, I think he was one of the originators, if I'm not mistaken, the UK's version of Lewis Kelso, perhaps in many ways. But there are many different things, including the fact that employee ownership trust, when I started the podcast, Chris Michael, who I've called the American Graham Nuttall for all the work he's done growing EOTs in the US. We discussed him coming on the podcast, and I was like, dude, I'm an ESOP trustee. I'm probably going to be really tough on you because I got questions, I got concerns, et cetera. And he fought a really tough uphill battle for a few years. And it wasn't until a whole bunch of people started seeing all of the success in the UK that we were able to say, hey, this makes a lot of sense. So there's a two-way street of the sharing and the learning and the education that goes very well together. And I just wanted to acknowledge that. So Campbell, as you know, we do like when our guests share their EO aha moment, and then that often leads us to interesting parts of the conversation. It's not the moment where you first heard about employee ownership or thought you might like it. It's a moment that in one form or another made you realize that EO could be transformative, that made you go, aha. And I was wondering if you have an EO aha moment you'd like to share.
I want to kind of say lots. The first one I had, though, which stuck with me, and I know this because it was 2009. So I'd been working in the UK Cabinet Office for 5 years. I'd left at the end of 2008. I'd started this new journey, with a for-profit consultancy. I'd been given John Lewis as this client, and I was getting to know them. And it was immediately post-crash, and I was pretty excited by how fair the model seemed to be, and a kind of a different way of doing business. And that's great, right? Because you can learn about the model and you can sort of see the mechanics of it, and people describe it to you, but it's like someone, describing meditation. It's like, okay, well, I understand the concept, but I've not done it. So I don't actually know what that means. And I don't know what it means at the level of individual behaviors. And I was at the top floor of the John Lewis partnership. I call them JLP, right, for short. So I was on the top floor of the JLP headquarters, Partnership House. This is in London. And the top floor is where the C-suite offices are and so on. And we were having a meeting up there. I went to the bathroom. And as I was leaving the bathroom, around the light switch, they have a little sign in their signature JLP green that says, "Switch off the light, don't burn our bonus." And I actually stopped and took a picture of it. And I still have this picture, which I use when I'm talking to interested companies, employee groups, employee owner groups, and so on, trustees, because I cannot convey how powerful that nudge came across to me. I was like, right down at that level of being able to say, it's a different relationship with the people in the business, and to be able to make that kind of appeal at that level of behavior. It was a penny drop moment for me, because it was just a moment I was like, oh, wow. Like, it was the first time I could imagine myself working in an employee-owned business. And from that moment, I was like, I need to work in this sector, not just advise it. I need to be in it, because there's something fundamental here, which just appeals to me.
I love that. And what kind of gave me a little bit of a shiver of excitement as you shared that was the realization. We hear stories like that on the Owner to Owner podcast all the time. My friend Jesse Tyler hosts it, that I produce. And it will often come up as an example of, hey, we're all in this together. But the C-suite of JLP is being mindful of something on such a molecular level that actually benefits everybody throughout the organization. And it's taking that out of the, it's up to the workers on the factory floor or on the retail floor, et cetera, and saying that we all need to be mindful. And it would seem to me that the light switch becomes an example for all aspects of how you run your business. It's not just the light switch. It's representative of everything else.
I think that, you're absolutely on the nail.
So one of the things that in reviewing material for this conversation and the studies that you've done, it has struck me that the models of types of employee ownership may vary. EOTs are prevalent in England. ESOPs in the United States, that's an act of Congress. In Australia, they're called employee share ownership plans, which is confusing, but they're not the US ESOPs. But what struck me in reviewing the material on your website is the things that you are researching are universal. That what is important to employee owners in England is the exact same thing as what's important to employee owners in the US and around the world, regardless of the capital structure of the business. Is that fair to say?
I think what you're highlighting is fundamentally important, like a tenet that I hold very dear. I don't want to speak on behalf of the US, but I can speak about my observation of the broader kind of mutuals sector, broader mutuals economy in the UK. It is a wonderful, powerfully passionate group of people, inspiring advocates in everywhere you look, in each corner. But it comes with a risk. Comes with a risk of fragmentation, comes with a risk of what somebody I used to work for once wonderfully termed the narcissism of small differences. And it is very easy to go down those rabbit holes and to expend energy, which as a small part of the economy we cannot afford to do, almost battling one another on this model versus this model. Should it be, kind of pure direct share ownership? Should it be done via a trust? Should it be smaller shareholders versus larger shareholding? Should it be cooperative, and so on? And I start from a very different place. I start from outcomes. I'm interested in understanding and seeing the material impact on lives and livelihoods. As a part of that, do I want the ability to disaggregate and say, oh, well, I wonder on this measure, let's say paying, a living wage, are worker co-ops better than EOT businesses, better than direct ownership businesses in the UK? That's interesting. I can tell you from the knowledge program, the 2-year program, that we did not find significantly statistical differences in the impacts achieved across those models. I want to be really clear here, right? The point is that getting apples for apples data across that broad range of models, we very deliberately set out to do, because it is unifying, because we were able to say the value, therefore, to the whole of the UK economy, is of this magnitude. It is potentially of this many billion in terms of productivity per year. Where we narrow, we can't do that. So being able to talk in those larger numbers and broader terms, it gets the attention of Treasury colleagues, gets the attention of capital providers. It opens the door for us then to have a meaningful conversation. So that's kind of point one in it. And point two is, we need to learn more about the mechanics. There's a lot of claims made on behalf of different models. What we can see is the commonality of outcome. And what I love, frankly, is that every time I sit and work with a business owner who's coming to this fresh, I don't know where they're going to end up, right? They may end up with a direct ownership model, and look, in the US, you have this fantastic ESOP model that, really powerful. One of the criticisms leveled against the EOT, the trust model, is that it is less powerful, that in some ways it is indirect ownership. You don't have a piece of paper saying, I individually own this many shares. You don't have an asset that accrues value in your name. You can share dividend at the every end of each share, but there's no moment where you leave or there's a sale event and
There's
you gain
no
that
ownership.
Right, exactly, right. So, but I'm afraid I'm a horrible, shameless pragmatist, Brett. I want outcomes that improve people's lives. And if the trust model is the thing that brings the owner to the table and then transfers ownership and it starts as a trust model, then fantastic. I'm very happy with that. What I would love is to bring in a version into the UK of an ESOP model. I'd love a kind of, an ESOP, something that combines perhaps a kind of trust and a direct share ownership element. We have a pension crisis in the UK just in the same way that you have a pensions savings crisis in the US. That recognition of the need to accrue value to afford the end of your life. We need that solution just as much. So, but what I like is that palette. I like the fact that there are different options that people can reach for and find the one that works best for their business, for their sector, for their employee group.
What struck me as you were talking, and I started my career, ironically enough, 16 years ago. You and I have tracked 2008, I began my first ESOP transaction. And the formal name of the podcast is the ESOP podcast, although I tend to call it the EO ESOP podcast to reflect talking about all forms of employee ownership. But there are definite disadvantages to the ESOP. They are expensive to create. They can be unwieldy. There are certain regulatory aspects of it that I support as a former trustee that I believe are very important, but can be a bit onerous, particularly for businesses on the smaller side. So to some extent, what I love focusing on, and your work does this so clearly, is that it is the outcome as far as what it is. And Canada, as I'm sure you have followed, recently they've acknowledged they want more of a push to employee ownership, and it's the EOTs, the trusts, that is the path that they are focused on, because and when I said you don't have ownership, I was making that metaphorical point. It was not meant to be a criticism of it. It's the real deal in terms of employee ownership. But boy, what a relatively easier path to get into employee ownership than ESOPs are.
I can't speak to the ESOP experience at a technical level, but what I can say is, the census data that we gathered for the knowledge program showed us that there's probably a long tail of smaller organizations in the UK business population. There's quite a lot of the worker cooperatives tend to be down at the smaller end, not all of them by any means, but there's quite a lot of the smaller worker co-ops, particularly as you get into micro businesses, kind of less than 10 people. The growth in the sector in the UK is increasingly coming from slightly larger, medium or small, large firms transitioning into the model. So there's definitely something that they like around that. The way the tax relief works in the UK, there's two tax reliefs around the trust. The first is for the selling owner. The second is for employee owners in the model who then don't pay income tax on an initial amount of any dividend they receive. So an important balance that. But we increasingly see what I would call hybrid transitions. So owners put a majority, so you only get that CGT, the capital gains tax relief for owners up front, if a majority over 50% is sold to the trust. So you're seeing that majority model, but also individual shareholders holding on to elements. So we've got an increasing number of hybrids where there's a mix of direct ownership and trust-based ownership. And we're seeing businesses lean into the specifics of their sector. I work with a global architecture and design firm who are in this model, and they have a hybrid. And in truth, if they want to retain talent and they want to recruit talent in that sector in the UK, senior people expect at least the potential of some kind of direct shareholder. So they need some freedom in that space. Now, if I was a purist, I might be saying, oh, no, we can't have this mix. But that's why I said, so I'm horribly pragmatic about this. If whatever model you have is making being an owner a meaningful experience, it's giving you meaningful opportunity to participate in how critical decisions are made in your business, and you are seeing the benefits of being an owner. And that could be a range of things, right? It might be cash in pocket. It might be that voice. It might be more investment by your business in looking after your well-being and your skills, training, development. It might even be, if it's important, and we know this is important, right, particularly to younger generations, survey data tells us, it might be that the business chooses to invest more in its environmental footprint, in achieving, being carbon neutral by 2025. And if that decision is influenced by the owners because voice is effective, then that is a consequence. That's an outcome of becoming employee owned. That's an impact I'm claiming on the part of being employee owned. And that's powerful and it's motivating. And if I'm really candid, the UK, this is well publicized. There's nothing dramatic in this, but we've spent 20 years with productivity, national productivity in the doldrums. There's a pretty good argument that our motivational model in all sorts of parts of our economy is broken. Levels of employees telling when they're asked, saying that they are, they don't feel motivated, they don't feel engaged at work, they don't feel like they're stakeholders in the economy. We know that younger generations are feeling disenfranchised, certainly in the UK. They don't have assets, they don't have company ownership, they struggle to get house ownership, flat ownership, and so on. Well, I mean, I'm looking at the data here. This isn't wishful thinking, and I'm seeing post-transition minimum 80% of employee owners in surveys saying that they feel greater job satisfaction having been made owners. I'm seeing material report on higher levels of investment in training development, higher levels of investment in health and well-being, higher basic minimum wage or living wage paid to workers in employee-owned businesses. 5 times less likely to lose your job in an employee-owned business, 8 times more likely if it's a small or medium-sized business. These are incredibly powerful, real economy data points. So yeah, we are in a position to be able to evidence to our employee shareholders, whether that's via a trust or a direct shareholding model, that they're seeing the benefits. And when they see the benefits, it's a virtuous circle. It switches on better top line, better ideas coming through from employees, more cost consciousness, better bottom line. And that's not just wishful thinking again. That's trend I've got new data which we haven't published yet, which is based on a really detailed analysis of profit and loss and balance sheet accounts for mid-cap firms, EO versus non-EO, match samples, and it shows the same thing, Brett. So, this. Sorry, I've gone off on one. I apologize. I'm on my soapbox. Let me finish, if you can bear it for another half a minute.
This is great, and I actually have some follow-up questions from your knowledge
Brilliant.
program. So no, this is wonderful.
Brilliant. But look, for me, the UK is desperately trying to hijack and solve this productivity issue in our economy, and there is a lot of focus. There's a lot of focus on where is innovation going to come from? Is it automation? Is it AI? Is it advanced manufacturing? Is it somewhere in the green economy? Where is, and let me tell you, if you put an intervention in front of me, which our knowledge program shows delivers as much as an 8 to 12% productivity uplift at the level of the individual employee, that's an innovation that you would be piling behind to scale as hard and as fast as you could. And that's where we are in our conversation with UK government, which is, look at this data. Even, if you chuck the Brexit, and the challenges, even if we had a modicum of optimism bias and we put a lot of counters in to make sure that we didn't get that in our sample, we looked at 10% of the employee-owned sector in the UK for the knowledge program. With the best will in the world, even if that productivity uplift was 4 to 5%, that's over twice what we're looking at over the next 5 years in terms of productivity uplift nationally as an economy. So, like I said, I don't care if I could put it as clumsily as that, whether it's a trust, whether it's a direct ownership model. What I see is you motivate people and you see a change. You see a change in their relationship to their employer, to what they get out of bed to do in the morning. And ultimately, you see a change in the fabric of their lives. That's pretty bloody powerful. So
it is very powerful indeed. There was so much good information there just on a technical level. I'll let you know, in the US with ESOPs, it is not unusual for the initial transaction to be a hybrid model. It is not unusual for the ESOP to be formed with a minority stake in the company. And there are lots of very pragmatic reasons to do it. But when we talk about overcoming confusion or misinformation, one of the things that would make me crazy is, I'd hear somebody say, hey, I want to do an ESOP. I only want to do 20% so I can make sure none of you bums are going to steal the company from me. That is not a valid reason, but there are plenty of reasons why the hybrid model. So that wasn't a surprise. It was interesting to me. That's kind of a newer phenomena there. And there are plenty of advisors, quite frankly, who push the hybrid model as a foot in the door. Let's, do this transaction and then we can add to it. It also struck me, Campbell, as you were talking, and the reality is we don't really do politics here on the podcast, but we can't help but notice political realities in the US and around the world. And certainly, we're focused in the US that no matter what you believe, half of the country seems to vehemently disagree with you. And I follow enough international news to know that, England and the UK have more than your share of battles along those lines. But not to talk politics per se, when we talk about the disenfranchisement of young people, and then we look at the hallmarks of employee ownership, and I think strand 2 of your knowledge program really covered this, the Good EO Project, and you listed practice areas that are foundational to good employee ownership. Transparent communication and sharing information should be huge with young workers. Culture and behaviors, huge with young workers. Employee voice, oh my goodness, that's what we do. That's what separates us from non-employee owned companies and perhaps even the private equity folks who are dipping their foot into the employee ownership space. Employee voice, sharing rewards, leadership and governance is improved, and there are a couple of more that you list, but all of those strike me are tailor-made, like if a bunch of young workers could sit in a room and say, what do we want out of our companies? We want these things. Employee ownership is the answer.
Yeah, look, I mean, you won't be surprised that I fundamentally agree with you. But look, I'm going to stick to this theme of pragmatism, right? I'm conscious, and I don't know, who will be listening to us, Brett, but I suspect we're preaching to the choir a fair bit, right? I suspect
sure.
we've got an audience who probably, kind of like this model already. But so I just want to say that nonetheless, I don't need the whole economy to be employee owned. Do want is broad opportunity for people to work for employee owned businesses. I want there to be more. So, there is our objective, if you like, for ownership at work. The next stage of what we're trying to do is create a center that will produce research with the aim that it helps double the size of the mutuals economy in the UK over the next 5 years. That we will work with the grain of whoever is in political power, obviously, in order to help make that happen. Do we need more than technical innovation to reset, the productivity of our economy? Yes. Is there a very human motivational driver in that? Yes. My son is 27, my daughter's 19, right? They're both entering this economy. If they're not, my son's already in it. And, they're wrestling with this. They're wrestling with wanting to feel a part of something, wanting to they want to address multiple motivators, right? They've got their individual motivator. They like the idea of belonging to something. They recognize that who they choose to work for says something about who they are, and the idea that they could be an owner. Well, this comes even right down to, do employee-owned businesses think about the mechanisms that reward people, right? So one of the things that I think is fantastic is to be conscious that if you're in a sector where people may only stay with you for 2 years or 5 years, shouldn't always have to be about join the employee-owned business and then you got to stay in it for 40 years. Actually, and that is one thing I do like about the trust model, is that the emphasis is really on sharing a profit that's made at the end of a year. And that does appeal to younger people. It's been my experience. That can be very compelling, very powerful. So yeah, I think your point about younger people is spot on. It's a part of this bigger piece about a motivational reset, I think, and I think employee ownership can deliver that.
In the US, we are very careful to nurture bipartisan support. And truly, it often feels like employee ownership is the only issue that consistently folks from both of our major parties can agree on. Is that a similar posture in the UK in terms of, and I don't even know if bipartisan support is the correct word for UK politics, but does it cross the bridge of various political parties?
It's an issue that I would say there is consensus on. It's, as you would know, it appeals to political sentiments on the right, based around entrepreneurialism, around economic resilience, self-sufficiency, the idea of individual ownership and the accountability and responsibility that comes with that. And on the left, it recognizes that it's a fairer way of sharing the proceeds and rewards of industry, that it is a way of putting a bit more typically into the pockets of people who often get very little, that it speaks to that sense of belonging and sense of a kind of communal identity and a shared set of values that a lot of people look for in the business, they work for. And our data showed that, actually beyond even just what's going on in terms of the impacts within a business on the employees, that when you compare employee-owned businesses with non-employee-owned businesses, and even I was surprised by this, the level of contribution to local communities from employee-owned businesses was absolutely off the chart in comparison. It really was. We calculate it was worth roughly over $500 million in terms of days of effort and value of material funding contributions into local causes in a year. The level of difference, right? It was absolutely fundamental. So, my observation would be, I have a challenge in my head, right? So I know that sometimes I've been challenged when talking about the knowledge program, and I talk about a stat like that and says, well, aren't these just good businesses anyway? Aren't these just businesses that happen to have high values, that happen to therefore have chosen employee ownership? Just to land this point in case any listeners are thinking that, look, I'm very comfortable with accepting that that is probably the case. But I would also add, in the work we did in the knowledge program, we put in a number of what I call fail safes. So we actually asked after questions within our survey, to what extent do you attribute these impacts to your employee-owned model? To what extent has this been the case since you became employee-owned? And for our Good EO project, you mentioned our second strand, where we interviewed the leaders of 65 employee-owned businesses. So kind of not that far off, kind of half of, so roughly 5% of the sector, 4 to 5% of the sector in the UK. And we asked them, what are the things you did that made the biggest difference? At once you were employee-owned, what were the ownership changes that you made that you associate with driving these business impacts? So we really made a point of making sure that we could attribute those impacts to the model, and it wasn't just coincidental. So I just think it was important to land that point, because when I make that wider community contribution, at one point, actually, you mentioned that you had a guy on the podcast historically, I believe, that who had established the first B Corp.
Yes.
So there's a really interesting affinity in the UK, certainly between the B Corp community and the employee-owned community, and a significant proportion of employee-owned businesses have also reached for B Corp status. And so I do think that attentiveness to external as well as internal stakeholders is something which is inherent in the model and the teams leading businesses in the model.
Hey friends, we're halfway through my conversation with Campbell McDonald. There's so much more interesting and, dare I say, important conversation to come. I hope you'll join us next week for part 2. Thank you so much for listening. This is Bret Keisling. Be well.
We'd love to hear from you. You can find us on Facebook at EO Podcast Network and on Twitter at ESOP Podcast. This podcast has been produced by Bret Keisling for the EO Podcast Network. Original music composed by Max Keisling. Branding and marketing by Bitsy Plus Design. And I'm Bitsy McCann.